So welcome everyone. This is the third meeting of the, is it the third meeting? Yeah, the third meeting of the Illuminating Friendship Network, and we are very lucky to have with us today as our speaker Dr. Cathy Mason, who's based at the Central European University in Vienna, and she's a philosopher who works mainly in ethics, epistemology and aesthetics, and with particular interests in Iris Murdoch's philosophical writings and in friendship. And today she will be speaking to us on friendship and equality. So over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Yeah, this is the first time I've presented this talk, so I'm very interested to hear what people's thoughts are on it, especially the latter part, which I'm not really certain about at all. Yeah, so I'd be very interested to hear what people's feelings are. Great. So this talks about friendship and equality, and what kind of equality friendship requires. So in a really widely discussed paper on friendship, Lawrence Thomas claims that good or deep friends can't be under the authority of one another. So friendship on his account requires a kind of equality, specifically equality of authority. And he argues that equality of this kind sits alongside mutual trust and voluntariness as one of the three distinctive features of companion friendship. So for him, it's kind of definitive of friendship that friends are, in this sense, equals. I think there seems to be something very right about that idea. It's very hard to imagine a genuine friendship, let alone a good or ideal one, in which one participant's authoritative over the other. And in that respect, friendship seems kind of strikingly unlike love. It seems very possible to love another person without them being your equal, and love another person even in the absence of their loving you back. Love doesn't seem to be called into question by inequality between the lover and the beloved, but intuitively, friendship seems quite different here. So although it hasn't been kind of much explicitly debated in the literature, the idea that deep friendship involves some kind of equality between the participants has been kind of unanimously endorsed by anybody who mentions it. But these endorsements have been largely unaccompanied by any specification of what kind of equality it is that these deep friendships require. And it doesn't seem that all friendships or all kinds of inequality are incompatible with friendship, not even all instances of inequality of authority. So it seems possible, though perhaps difficult, say, for a junior faculty member to have a deep friendship with the department chair, for example, despite that clearly being a relationship of inequality of authority of some kind. So I think although it's very intuitive that deep friendship requires some kind of equality of authority, it hasn't really been kind of sufficiently spelled out or defended exactly what kind of equality is required, or defended as to why it might require this. And it's especially intriguing as a question, given that love is plausibly a central component of friendship, and that this kind of equality doesn't seem to rule out loving someone well. So in this paper, I kind of first think about what kind of equality of authority friendship requires, and then the bit I'm slightly more doubtful about, I offer an explanation as to why that might be. So I'm going to begin by just presenting a couple of cases of friendship, each of which involves some kind of inequality of authority. And I'll suggest that in some of these cases, good friendship seems to intuitively be ruled out, and in other cases it doesn't. And then I'll go on to explore an initial explanation of that based on differences of autonomy, and suggest that that can't really give us what we're looking for. And then I'll offer my own account of the differences between these cases, and finally go on to explain why that might be. So before jumping into this, I want to note that I'm asking which kinds of inequality of authority are incompatible with deep friendship, not kind of merely friendly relations. You know, it seems clear that you can have kind of generally friendly relations with all sorts of people, regardless of the kind of hierarchies between you and authority relations. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this kind of deep friendships, things that realize kind of the core goods of friendships that are intimate, and so on, that realize goods like mutual understanding and support and so on and so forth. And it's these kinds of deep friendships where you really know and care about the other, where you're committed to one another and so on, that I think are incompatible with certain kinds of inequality of authority, not the merely friendly relationships. And of course, I'm only considering inequality within relationships that would otherwise look like candidates for good friendships. There are all sorts of cases in which people are in unequal relationships that look bad for other sorts of reasons, and I'm not considering those. So to begin with, these 3 cases of inequality, and these are on the handout. So my basic claim here is that some instances of inequality of authority seem completely innocuous, they seem compatible with deep friendship, whereas other instances seem to speak against the very possibility of deep friendship. So I'm going to offer these 3 cases with which to begin to explore what kind of inequality of authority rolls out good friendship. And in them, I'm going to suggest that case 1 and case 2 are going to be compatible with deep friendship, whereas the third case isn't. So the first case, which I've just mentioned, is a new philosopher joins the university department, becomes friends with the department head. The two do enjoy discussing philosophy, but they also share other interests in literature and film. They go to do other things and so on. So they seem to be friends, but the department head does, of course, have a certain kind of professional authority over the newcomer. And so the two are going to be unequal in this significant respect. Case 1. Case 2 is of 2 friends who regularly meet for dinner. One of them is a gourmet with a keen interest in food and wine. And because of that keen interest, they always order for the both of them. And the other friend kind of defers to their opinions. If they say this wine is really good and it would go well with that fish, the other friend kind of accepts their view. They know what they're talking about. So they defer to their opinions and their food choices. They assume the gourmet who knows what they're talking about, and they'll make good choices. So that friendship also, I think, is going to be unequal in that the gourmet has authority regarding food. But that also looks perfectly compatible, I think, with good friendship, good deep friendship. The third case, taking from Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and in that novel, George and Lenny are 2 itinerant labourers who together travel around looking for work. They're clearly close, and they do share quite a deep emotional bond. But George clearly has authority over Lenny, right? He tells him what to do, he makes the plans, and Lenny defers to his plans. He tells Lenny where they're going and what he should do, and Lenny just does what George tells him to. And that's particularly clear in some cases where what they want diverges. So there's a kind of opening scene where Lenny has this dead mouse in his pocket, which he wants to stroke because it's really soft. And George gets him to throw it away because it's unhygienic to have a dead mouse rotting in your pocket. And Lenny's really heartbroken about this. He wants this lovely thing. He thinks it's so soft, so wonderful to pet. But despite really wanting to keep it, he throws it away just to obey George's order. It's not because he can see that it's unhygienic to have it in your pocket, or because he ultimately agrees with George that perhaps it's unwise. He's just kind of deferring to George's command. So there's a clear, huge hierarchy between them. George is clearly authoritative over Lenny, and in this case it looks really problematic for thinking that they are deep friends. And it's not because the relationship isn't loving or caring. It's a very kind of loving, caring relationship. They really are, in some sense, committed to one another. The real problem just seems to be that the two relate to one another on such an unequal footing. And in fact, in some ways you might think, well, it looks less like a friendship and more like a parent-child relationship or something, because their roles are so hierarchical. But of course, all three of these cases do involve some kind of inequality of authority between the participants. So my question here is kind of, why does the inequality of authority in the third case seem to rule out it being a good, deep friendship, whereas in the first two cases, it seems compatible with having a good friendship, even if it might make it harder or something like that to have that deep friendship. So one perhaps initially tempting answer is that there's an imbalance of autonomy, which explains why inequality of authority can be problematic. So autonomy has often been thought to be important within friendship. And Joseph Cooper, for example, takes autonomy to be really central to friendship when he discusses parents' capacity to be friends with their children. So in that discussion, he suggests that the imbalance of autonomy between parents and children rules out that relationship from being a friendship relationship. He argues that deep friendships require friends to be equally autonomous within the relationship, and he understands that as requiring that the participants be equally able to determine themselves and their actions on the basis of their beliefs and values. So it's clear that in the third case, Lenny isn't autonomous in that way. His plans and his beliefs are just kind of determined, or at least largely determined, by George's plans and George's beliefs. And even his day-to-day instructions are often determined by these kind of quite detailed instructions that George gives him. Lenny just accepts those instructions and follows them. But I don't think this difference in autonomy doesn't in and of itself explain why the two aren't deep friends, because turning to cases 1 and 2, we can see that they also plausibly involve some kind of asymmetry of autonomy. So in case 1, there's an asymmetry of autonomy in that the head of department has the authority to determine certain things for the newcomer, right? So they might have the ability to kind of determine what they teach and determine what committees they serve on and so forth. And so there's an imbalance of autonomy there. And it might even be quite a significant imbalance of autonomy. You know, the time that the newcomer to the department spends on committees and teaching and such things might actually be a quite significant portion of their life. Right, in the second case, there's also going to be a certain inequality of autonomy because, well, what the friend eats and what they drink is dependent on the aesthetic beliefs or gustatory values of the gourmet. So in both those cases, they seem to involve an inequality of autonomy in the sense that for outlines, and yet in both cases, it seems like that kind of inequality could be harnessed for the friendship. So what further differences might there be between these inequality of autonomies? Well, one important feature that case 2 has, that of the gourmet and their friend, and case 3 lacks, is that the inequality of autonomy is negotiated by the participants, or at least, you know, we can assume so. You know, we can imagine that the gourmet's authority isn't just assumed or asserted, but it's accepted by their friend as such. They take the gourmet to have the relevant expertise, and so they defer to them, to their kind of relative authority in that matter. So that inequality might be kind of, in a sense, chosen, and we might think that they retain a kind of higher order autonomy by deferring to expertise. And of course, that's unlike the of mice and men case, where we might think that in a significant sense, Lenny doesn't choose to defer to George. But again, this can't quite be the explanation, and that's because it can't explain why the inequality in case 1 is compatible with deep friendship. The authority that the head of department has over the new hire isn't a matter for negotiation. The new hire couldn't, at least, while keeping their job, choose to ignore the head of department's wishes about which committees they join, or they couldn't refuse to do certain necessary teaching or something like that. They're not able to negotiate their kind of positions in that kind of way. The new hire couldn't just choose to have a position of more equal authority. So the idea that unnegotiated inequality and autonomy is what's detrimental to friendship doesn't seem quite right. So a further difference between case 1 and case 3, between the new hire case and the of mice and men case, that we might think is significant, is that the head of department's authority is very limited. So it covers some professional issues, but nothing else. So the head of department can assign teaching responsibilities or committee responsibilities, say, but they can't determine a schedule for the newcomer's household chores. So their authority is very much limited to this professional domain. And that seems very different to the case of George and Lenny, where the imbalance of authority seems kind of general. There's no limit to the scope of that imbalance. And that makes it plausible that inequality of authority must necessarily be limited. Certainly, general inequality of authority seems to rule out good friendship, but I don't think that that's quite sufficient to ensure that good friendship is possible. So you can imagine a case a bit like the George and Lenny case, where one person has great authority over the other person's life plans or something, but the other person has authority over, say, matters of food and drink or something like that. And that wouldn't seem enough for them to be able to have a deep friendship. It seems like more equality than that is somehow necessary. So the mere fact that the inequality is in some respect limited doesn't seem enough to ensure that deep friendship is possible. So I'm going to go set aside this idea of autonomy now and offer my own response to this. So to start thinking about which kinds of inequality are compatible and which are incompatible with friendship, I want to start by thinking about kind of friendship more generally, and think about what kind of equality is required by that. So an initial kind of equality required by friendship is symmetricity, right? So there's a kind of equality in the fact that friendship is a symmetrical relationship. Both in friendship, both participants fill the same general role towards one another. So I can stand to you as a friend, only if you stand to me as such. And that's unlike lots of kind of formally hierarchical roles, like, say, teacher and student, something like that, which require the other person to fill a different and complementary and hierarchically ordered role. And in that regard, as I kind of started by noting, friendship seems unlike love, which doesn't seem to put at this kind of necessary constraint. Love doesn't seem to require that the beloved actively fills a complementary role. Your claims to love someone aren't undermined by their failure to love you. And that's kind of an initial sense in which friendship is an egalitarian relationship. It requires the same general role to be occupied by each participant. Of course, this symmetricity in general role is perhaps too minimal a form of equality to be the equality requirement on deep friendship. Because after all, we might think George is a friend to Lenny, and Lenny is a friend to George, so they meet this really minimal requirement. But importantly, the senses in which they stand as friends to one another are very different here. So the sense in which George is a friend to Lenny is that George cares for him and he acts as something like his guardian. Whereas the sense in which Lenny is a friend to George is that he meets George's need for basic companionship, for someone to care about who will in turn care for him. And he seems more like George's ward or some kind of role like that. So whilst they're both friends to one another, the specific roles in which they stand as friends to one another are deeply hierarchically ordered. George stands to Lenny as his guardian, Lenny stands to George as his ward. So the specific roles they play aren't merely different, but they're importantly unequal in authority. And this undermines our thinking of the relationship as a deep friendship. So this idea that the roles which deep friends occupy within a relationship must be equal in authority is the main one which I want to think about. The explanation for why George and Lenny can't have the best or the fullest kind of friendship, this deep friendship, is, I want to suggest that the roles they occupy are too unequal. So as I'm understanding this kind of idea of a role, there's something that's kind of constituted by an ongoing task, guided within the relationship, kind of guided by a set of norms and expectations. Right, so Lenny has the kind of expectation that George will guide him, that he'll give him advice on what to do, and so on. George has the expectation that Lenny will do what he says, that he'll continue to move around with him, so on and so forth. So a friendship might standardly involve roles like being an advisor, being a supporter, so on and so forth, as well as, you know, maybe some more specific roles, like being the map reader on joint journeys or something like that. So of course, this needs to be more fully filled out, since both case 1 and case 2 seem to also involve hierarchically ordered roles of some kind. The gourmet is recognized as an expert of some kind by their friend, so their roles are unequal. And the head of department, obviously, again, has a different and unequal role. So more specifically, my claim is that insofar as there's inequality of authority within the roles that structure the relationship can't be a deep friendship. So inequality within roles that don't structure the relationship is fine, or at least not necessarily problematic, whereas inequality of authority within the roles that structure a relationship is going to kind of itself rule out deep friendship. So I think there's an important difference between the case of George and Lenny and that of the gourmet and their friend. You know, I said a minute ago that a limit on the inequality of authority seems necessary for deep friendship, but insufficient. And I think this gives us an indication of what's required. The unequal specific roles that George and Lenny occupy are absolutely central to their relationship in a way that, you know, we can assume they aren't for the gourmet and their friend. So the inequality of authority between George and Lenny looks more like a kind of dominating aspect of the friendship itself, which kind of structures nearly all of the ways in which they relate to one another. And that needn't be true of the gourmet and their friend. That the gourmet puts in the food order for both of them needn't suggest then that the friendship isn't a deep instance of friendship, because that role needn't play an important part in the structure of their relationship. So what exactly is it for a role to be central to the structure of the relationship? I mean, I don't think that's going to be an all or nothing matter. Of course, there won't be a sharp distinction between roles that are central and ones that aren't, but it seems like roles central to the relationship are going to be more central insofar as they have a deep influence on the ways in which participants relate to one another. So the more a role structures the relationship, the more widely the norms and the expectations associated with that role will apply within the relationship more generally. So to take a very different example, in a parent-child relationship, that the parent is likely to deeply influence the way they interact with the child, and is going to be typically central to the structure of that relationship. So that kind of inequality of authority is likely to influence many norms for their interactions. So it might be the case that the child isn't able to tell the parent when to go to bed, but the parent can tell the child when to go to bed. The parent might be able to tell the child when to stop eating sweets, but the child might not be in a position to tell the parent to do so, for example. So that kind of the norms associated with those roles are likely to be kind of absolutely central to the way that those people interact. It's going to have an effect on this kind of large swathe of norms for their interaction. And that's unlike a role, say, like the parent might also be a homework assistant for the child, and that might have kind of specific norms and expectations as well, but that's not likely to influence many of their interactions. Those norms are likely to kind of remain kind of isolated to these instances when they're actually doing homework together. So the idea that only inequality between roles that significantly structure a friendship is incompatible with deep friendship explains why case 2 might be a deep friendship despite the participants occupying some unequal roles. But what about case 1? There, the department chair and the newcomer are part of a formal hierarchy where one individual has authority over the other. So crucially, I think whether this is an obstacle to there being deep friends will depend then on kind of how far beyond or how far outside those professional roles their relationship extends. So if their relationship is largely confined to the professional context in which they are unequal, then however much they like or admire each other, I think it seems that they can't have a deep friendship, because within that professional context, norms of deference to the chair's suggestions, for example, might hold. And it may well be the case that those norms spill over to other contexts. So the newcomer might also defer to the chair's suggestions about where to get coffee, for instance. So when those norms structure the relationship more generally, the two, I think, can't be deep friends. But on the other hand, the relationship might extend far beyond the professional context. And in that case, I think it seems possible for them to have a deep friendship by being able to move beyond the set of hierarchical norms that apply to those unequal roles. So, for example, the newcomer might defer to the chair on strictly professional matters, but there might be equal norms in play in many other areas of their interactions. So they might have equal inputs when deciding where to get dinner. They might be able to critique each other's views on literature. They might have equal uptake of each other's book suggestions. They might equally contribute to planning holidays, so on and so forth. So in that case, the kind of hierarchical norms from within this kind of professional context would be peripheral to the structure of the relationship as a whole. They could be kind of isolated to this one small area. So I think this explanation has the advantage of explaining both why case 1 is compatible with being deep friends, but also of suggesting an explanation as to why forming deep friendships in these kinds of contexts can be very difficult. It's compatible because compatible with having a deep friendship because the relationship can extend beyond this arena in which one person has authority over the other. And so you can occupy different roles. But on the other hand, forming these deep friendships in these contexts is going to be very difficult because moving beyond this unequal realm and setting aside these roles and these norms can be very kind of psychologically and socially difficult. And, that's particularly the case when the participants have to, in certain social contexts, the workplace ones, revert to those hierarchically ordered roles and norms. So my suggestion is that inequality of authority within the roles that structure the friendship is incompatible with deep friendship. And that other kinds of inequality of authority, though they might influence how likely you are to bond with the other person, or that kind of thing, are at least potentially compatible with deep friendship. And this is also going to allow not just an explanation of why these formal relationships of inequality of authority can bar deep friendship, but why these more informal cases that can happen too, as well as allowing that friends can have different roles regarding one another, and they can even have different hierarchically ordered ones. So it's possible for a friend with a better sense of direction to take charge of map reading when traveling and just give directions, but function very much like orders. Go left here, we're going, I don't know, for 10 miles this way or something like that. So that's my account of which inequalities are incompatible with friendship. I'm going to go on to what I've put as section 3 on the handout, why inequality is incompatible. So in the paper that I mentioned at the beginning, the Lawrence Thomas paper, Thomas suggests that there are 2 reasons why equality of authority is one of the core features of friendship. And he suggests that firstly, it can be an obstacle to forming a bond of mutual trust. And secondly, he thinks it hinders self-disclosure. So he thinks that of those 3 features that are definitive of friendship, you need equality of authority because it's necessary for mutual trust and mutual self-disclosure. But I think, although it seems right that inequality of authority often does that, it seems a partial explanation of why inequality is incompatible with deep friendship. And I think that's because unequal relationships seem to me to be able to involve quite a high degree of trust. It seems like you might have a lot of trust that somebody will fill their unequal role. It seems possible for a superior to have quite a lot of trust that someone in an inferior role, say, will fulfill their role, and vice versa. So it's not obvious that trust has to take the other person as an equal at all, right? So, a parent and a child, for example, might have a really trusting relationship, despite that relationship being one of unequal authority. The second bit, self-disclosure, also seems to me to have a kind of not straightforward connection to equality. It's not obvious that viewing another person as your equal is going to increase self-disclosure rather than decreasing it. So, for example, George can speak really relatively very freely to Lenny. And that's in part because he knows, well, Lenny isn't going to fully understand his words, and so on. And it seems like viewing someone as your unequal might help you feel freer from judgment or something like that, rather than as your equal. So I think the connections that he suggests between equality and trust and equality of self-disclosure are going to be fairly loose. It's not that equality is going to always increase trust or always increase self-disclosure. there seem plenty of instances, plenty of scenarios in which they might decrease, equality might decrease those things. And instead, I think the importance of equality is well explained by the notion of voluntariness in friendship. So Thomas identifies this voluntariness as another key definitive feature of friendship alongside equality of authority. And I think that those two are the two that are related. I think that friendship requires equality of authority because it's required for the relationship to be voluntary in the fullest sense. So there are various senses in which a relationship might be voluntary or freely chosen. The first is just the sense in which you might agree to a general kind of relationship. In that sense, becoming an employee is to enter a voluntary relationship. And another sense in which a relationship might be voluntary is that the specifics of that relationship, the specific ways that you relate, might be freely chosen. And in that sense, the employer-employee relationship is very unlikely to be a voluntary one, since the specifics of that relationship are unlikely to be negotiable. So both the kind of general kind of relationship and the specific relationship, the particular way in which you relate, can be matters over which you have some kind of choice, and where the idea of voluntariness seems somehow relevant. I think that deep friendships are going to have to be voluntary or chosen in both of these senses, that the participants, they don't just choose to participate in this general kind of relationship, they also freely chose to relate to one another in this specific kind of way. Deep friends don't just choose that, they relate to one another as friends, they choose how to do so. It's got to be a kind of voluntary, specific relationship. And I think that it's only in a relationship where there's a voluntary specific relationship, so not just a choice to enter the relationship, but a choice to relate to one another in that specific kind of way, that the ways that the participants relate to one another can manifest intimacy. So I think for the participants' actions to manifest intimacy, the participants must kind of see themselves and their actions as ones that kind of best express their relationship, best express their feelings for one another. And if only the general relationship and not the specific relationship are voluntary, it's going to kind of preclude that. So for example, intimacy can be, or feelings of friendship generally can be manifested in lots of different ways, and whether within your relationship it's manifested by kind of provocative teasing or sympathetic conversation will depend on whether the participants kind of choose it as an expression of their friendship, whether they voluntarily have some norm of doing so as an expression of their care for one another. So, for example, think about George and Lenny's relationship. At the beginning of that book, they spend the night camping outside the farm where they go on to work. If it were kind of fully chosen, fully voluntary, fully chosen by both of them, that choice could have been an expression of intimacy, of desire to express their appreciation of one another or something by doing so. But as it stands, Lenny in fact just accepts George's plan to stay there the night. And I think that kind of precludes it from being an expression of intimacy on his part. I think as intimate relationships, deep friendships require that the specific relationship, as well as the general kind of relationship, is voluntary. So inequality of authority within the roles that are central to the structure of a relationship, I think, is going to prevent this specific relationship from being fully voluntary. Since the person with lower authority defers to the person with higher authority, they don't have the kind of standing to freely choose the specific relationship. The specific relationship just kind of isn't within the realm of choice for them. So inequality of authority within the roles that structure the relationship excludes the specific relationship from the sphere where it's kind of a possibility to voluntarily choose it. And as such, I think it kind of prevents it from expressing the core goods of friendship, like intimacy. Prevents it from being fully voluntary. So deep friendships, I think, must be fully voluntary, in that both the general kind of relationship and the specific relationship are fully chosen by the participants. And so, although I've kind of disagreed with Thomas on his specific explanation of why deep friendship requires equality of authority, I do think his paper provides the kind of seeds of a broader explanation by giving us this other idea of voluntariness, which I think is connected with the importance of equality of authority. So just to sum up what I've said, I've argued that deep friendship requires the friends to be equal within those roles that structure the relationship. And I've suggested that that kind of inequality can be an obstacle to realizing certain goods of friendship, like trust or mutual self-disclosure. But more importantly, that kind of equality is necessary for the relationship to be fully voluntary, so that unequal relationships might realize some goods of friendship, but unnecessarily fall short of deep friendship. Thank you.